What's up gamers, DreamcastGuy here, talking today about the top 5 worst Resident Evil games. Resident Evil has always been one of my favorite survival horror franchises, with all the cool scares and great environments, but these are 5 that are undoubtedly the worst in a long series of good games. Number 5. Resident Evil Survivor. A first-person Resident Evil game sounded great when we first heard it, but it turned out awful. Sluggish controls, terrible looking environments, and they didn't even bother making new character models for the zombies. If you look closely, you'll notice that all the character models, including monsters, are just taken directly from Resident Evil 2. Even if you did manage to really like this strange title, you're still going to be let down because the game is only 3 hours long. Here in North America, we actually got a slightly different version of this game as well. In Japan and Europe, you could plug in the PlayStation Light gun. This made it where you could control your character with the controller and shoot at the zombies with your gun, but they removed this in America due to the recent Columbine shootings. When this game came out, they tried to advertise it as an off-the-rails shooter, because at the time, in arcades, on-rails shooters were extremely popular, but what we got instead was just a half-hearted shill, and I'm really glad this game was forgotten in the pages of history. Number 4. Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. In the early 2000s, online games were really getting popular, and the guys over at Resident Evil really wanted to give it a shot and jumped in wholeheartedly. The result was Resident Evil Outbreak File 1 and File 2. These games controlled just like a classic Resident Evil, but multiplayer. You'd be dropped into an environment, trying to solve puzzles, find items, and dodge monsters, and overall they were pretty decent. Well, number 1 was pretty decent. Number 2, on the other hand, had some glaring flaws. The game takes place in Racoon City, having you play as one of several survivors trying to work together to get out of the city. Unfortunately, the graphics were murky, the characters ridiculous, and the monsters themselves would sometimes just break and stand against walls. But to top it off, there's actually a level in Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 where you're going through a zoo filled with zombie animals. Soak that in, ladies and gentlemen. That is a giant zombie elephant getting stabbed by a bored-looking dude. This is survival horror at its very darkest. I do hope they try and do another classic-style online Resident Evil, but hopefully we don't see any more zombie lions, tigers, or bears, because Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is really bad. Number 3. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. This is the most recent title on the list, and one that personally let me down the hardest. This game was advertised as a retelling of Resident Evil 2, showing us more of what Umbrella Special Forces were doing in Raccoon City during the fall. It plays like a squad-based shooter where you have teams of 4 going against another team of 4 players, trying to kill players, get points, and capture viruses. The problem is, the game is a mess. The controls make no sense, characters have crazy powers like invisibility and shooting lightning, it just has nothing to do with Resident Evil at all. The biggest problem in this game is that the programming is just atrocious. You'd have monsters spawn out of the ceiling and just start running in circles. I replayed this again recently to see if it was as bad as I remembered. At one point I got cornered on a roof by a hunter, but before it could strike the killing blow, it for some reason just jumped off like it suddenly remembered it had a dentist's appointment. I'm glad that the Resident Evil makers did this, because now they're never going to make this mistake again. It's hard to be afraid of zombies when you're basically playing as a character with superpowers. Number 2. Resident Evil Gaiden. Capcom really wanted to make a Resident Evil game on the Game Boy Color for a long time. They even tried out a lot of prototypes, making 2 full games before finally releasing Resident Evil Gaiden. Honestly though, I have no idea why they thought this game was a well-built idea. This Resident Evil title has you running around on a ship covered in zombies, and you'll be feeling fear because the controls are terrible. As you run around the environment looking for clues and items, whenever you get close to a monster, you get pulled onto this sliding bar minigame where you have to press A at the right moment to shoot monsters. The graphics for a Game Boy Color game are honestly pretty damn good, but since you keep getting pulled into these terrible shooting minigames, you never get a chance to actually enjoy this primitive art style. I mean, seriously, when you get pulled into this minigame, they didn't even bother making backgrounds behind the monsters. It just looks like they're standing in a huge black room. I'm just baffled why they didn't go for a more normalized control style. I was a really big fan of the Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color, and that controlled fantastically with an isometric view, so they could have done it that style, but instead I guess they really wanted to blaze their own path. If you see this Resident Evil game in a clearance bin somewhere and you're thinking it's going to be a good Game Boy title, do yourself a favor and buy Tetris instead. Number 1. Resident Evil 2 on the Gamescom. In the early 90s, you had a lot of handheld options. You had the Game Boy, you had the Game Gear, and you had Tiger handhelds. Tiger games were pretty bad, consisting of a fixed screen with lights that would flicker on and off to simulate action taking place on the screen. As bad as these Tiger games were, people kept buying them and they kept making a profit. In the late 90s, Tiger Electronics decided they wanted to take on the big boys and release their own full-blown handheld gaming device, the Gamecom. This thing was bad, and I mean really, really bad. To try and make up for the fact that the screen was blurry and the graphics were bland, Tiger used their money to buy the rights to key franchises, one of these being Resident Evil. This is Resident Evil 2 on the Gamescom. This is the worst Resident Evil ever made. Look at it. I don't even have to explain why it's bad. This was a real game released by a real team of programmers with the balls to call it a Resident Evil. This game was supposed to be Resident Evil 2, the title many consider to be the best in the entire series. I don't even know where to begin with it. The controls are terrible, every character is stuck walking in straight lines, there's no music, and all you hear are terrible footsteps and shooting noises. This game is terrible, and that's why I am crowning it the worst Resident Evil ever. Thanks so much for watching, guys. This has been another Top 5 made off your suggestions, so thanks so much for everybody who leaves me good comments on great ideas for future Top 5s and Top 10s. If you liked this video, share it with your Resident Evil fans, but do me a big favor and subscribe. And at the end of the day, keep dreaming. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, maybe check out my last video. Please subscribe, and if you want, share this somewhere with your friends.